My name is Lisa Garcia. I am the chair of the board for Indigenous Roots, which is a nonprofit organization here in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota. Our mission is to advance lifelong learning, health, and wellness amongst Indigenous peoples in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. I'm also a licensed attorney who's always worked on the advancement of Indigenous rights and human rights here in North America, which we also refer to as Turtle Island.
This is a militarized police force up against an unarmed, peaceful, prayerful people.
They're essentially doing these demonstrations because this has been an incursion on their treaty lands. For the Oceti-Sakowin, and the Standing Rock Sioux tribe is one of the divisions of the Oceti-Sakowin, of the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota nations. This incursion on the treaty lands stems back from the first colonizing part of the United States government in the area, geographically. Treaty rights are established underneath the United States Constitution, which gives precedent and states that treaties are the supreme law of the land. And with that recognition includes treaties of the United States has made with Indian nations that were here from time immemorial and are still here today. Because the treaties are supreme law of the land, the United States government has to follow those treaties. There's two treaties that were signed, 1851 and 1868, that established the boundaries of the tribal nations that they would be able to retain, and it wasn't given to them. It just means a recognition of their inherent right to maintain and retain their sovereignty over their homelands and their territorial ancestral lands. After that was passed, or the United States Constitution was adopted and then ratified by the Senate, obviously, there were subsequent laws passed. You had the National Environmental Protection Act, the Clean Water Act. I think there's a Harbor and Water Act, other kind of federal laws that would apply, that if the federal government is going to either cause some sort of disruption in our natural environment, whether it's in our water or our environment, they had to go through certain different levels of consultation with peoples before they made the decision to actually implement a plan to disrupt the natural environment. So you have the United States Constitution, you have federal law, and then you have international instruments that are norms for Indigenous peoples worldwide, such as the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This document, the UN DRIP, Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, requires free, prior, and informed consent on all lands, territories, and resources of Indigenous peoples for any type of incursion, and I'll call it an incursion because that's exactly what it is, or a request to appropriate, disrupt, or somehow destroy existing territorial boundaries of Indigenous nations. And this is exactly, once again, what the United States government is doing. Because the consultation never happened, and because the Army Corps of Engineers, which is under the umbrella of the executive branch of the federal government, didn't listen and didn't have meaningful consultation with the tribal nations, in particular Standing Rock Sioux tribe, they engaged and called out for support and solidarity from all Indigenous nations to stop this pipeline. And they have used a multi-strategy approach and different tactics, but they are founded in two very consistent principles in the whole time. One is it would be prayerful. The significance of the being prayerful has to do with what the traditions of the Indigenous peoples have always been adhered to, based on their ancestral teachings and what their traditional elders and spiritual leaders are telling them how to proceed. The second piece is this is peaceful. There cannot be any violence perpetrated by tribal nations against the federal government, and they have not done any of that. In actuality, the opposite is true, where the federal government, and actually in this case the state governments, have used very militarized and violent tactics against Indian people.
Move to the south and you will not be arrested!
We're
going to need several. We're going to bypass this group.
Try to bypass.
You'll look at what's happening on the ground in North Dakota. It's been repressive. There were security guards that were hired by the Energy Transfer Partners, Dakota Access Pipeline Corporation, that had hired these security guards to so-called protect their easement interests in lands that they were already bulldozing up there. What happened is they brought in dogs, and the dogs were unleashed, viciously unleashed amongst the demonstrators when they were engaged in a peaceful demonstration at the Standing Rock Sioux land. You'd also seen another things what they do is they do Army checkpoints, much like Army checkpoints. They called out the National Guard. The governor of North Dakota has called out the National Guard and has asked for their assistance in putting up what I call them roadblocks or security checkpoints. They've called them information points, which is bogus because really what they're doing is surveilling the people, license plate, who's passing through. They have cameras out there, facial recognition. Then, of course, they're also using another apparatus, which are drones. Drones, there have been reports of drones going through the camp at high level or way up, at high levels in the air, and also the helicopters. And this is a daily kind of harassment and surveillance that's going on by North Dakota officials, sanctioned by the North Dakota governor. The other part of the government's response is the federal government. The federal government has been a little bit more, I should say, responsive because they fear of stuff really getting enough people galvanized to make some even more serious demonstrations against the construction of that pipeline and their failure to engage in their very basic laws, such as the ones I mentioned before, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, and others with their consultation requirement with tribal nations. And also, of course, the treaty lands. And that goes way back from the start of the United States government formulating itself and then imposing itself upon other indigenous peoples, in this case, nations, and Standing Rock Sioux tribe being part of the Oceti-Sakowee, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota Nation. So what you have is a government response where the feds, are reacting slowly. They did temporarily, through their executive branch, the Department of Army, which is the Army Corps of Engineers, that issues the permits to the corporation so that they can drill on either side of the river and burrow under the river. They also have they're stopping the permits, so you have the Department of Army, you have the Department of Interior, and you also have the Department of Justice, that's right, that came back and said to them, okay, halt Dakota Access Energy, stop your drilling underneath the river, or not letting them drill underneath the river, I should say, but stop all activities on the lands where we have allowed you to have an easement on because it's quote unquote owned by the Army Corps of Engineers. So they've gone ahead, they've stopped their activities that has to do specifically with the Dakota Access easement areas that they secured from the federal government, and the federal government says stop. They're not going to allow them to proceed in those areas. But the other areas that was secured through private land, eminent domain, which is giving public utility companies, corporations, the right to act as government, condemn private property of ranchers and farmers, and give them so-called fair market value of the property and then take their property, basically is what happens. So the government's response is to try to halt some parts of what it can do until it can have further consultation with the tribe. So that's a good thing. And a lot of that occurred because of the international pressure, the national pressure, and local grassroots groups moving closer and pushing local activism actions on the ground. So that's kind of a quick rundown of what the government's response has been. So our organization, Indigenous Roots, led by our co-directors, Marianne and Sergio Quiros, organized a caravan of 2 buses with other organizations, nonprofit organizations, to bring a lot of the Native youth here in the Minneapolis and St. Paul area, Twin Cities, up to Standing Rock to do service work, to give some folks some relief in the kitchen, to help build structures that are needed for winterizing, and also to deliver supplies and some other items like tents, so that the folks that are staying in there during throughout the winter to continue on doing the demonstrations, the activities to stop the oil pipeline are supported, further supported from for their needs, you know, supplies, food, what have you. We do have to understand a couple of things here. The fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline is one struggle of a long and intense history with the United States government, its colonial predecessors, and currently the United States government, imposing its ideologies, practices, and laws upon and Indian nations to displace them. That's the basis of much of the problem we have here today. And Indian nations, First Nations, since the time of the so-called Columbus washing up on Boriken, our homelands, my homelands, when he first washed up there on the shore, Indian nations have been fighting, indigenous nations have been fighting against their colonial oppressors, and it continues today.